So our next speaker is Alain de Coessemaeker. I'll try to pronounce it right. He is a biocentric and ethical vegetarian since 1984 and was involved in the first animal rights movement, ADB, in Belgium in 1990. In his presentation, Alain will talk about the rights of trees and examine how tree rights and animal rights philosophy are linked. Please welcome Alain.
Yeah, thank you. I will first present myself, and then I will make a description of the problem, then the cause of the problem, then the consequences of the problem, and the solutions to the problem. So everybody knows how a tree looks like normally. Well, I show you a picture of how a tree looks like after a lawsuit in Bruges, in Belgium, in the city where I live. This is a picture from 1 month ago. This is an oak tree of more than 100 years old. So, wow, that says enough of how we think about trees, I think. First, I present myself. So my name is Alain de Coessemaeker. Since childhood on, after losing my mom, being 4 years old, I developed a deep sensitivity and special relationship with the animals and the trees living in my garden. From there, I evolved to become a vegetarian in 1984, so now, meanwhile, 30 years or something. And then later I became vegan. And I was first a member of a group, SED, in Belgium. It's an organization whose purpose was to stop animal experiments. Then later in the University of Ghent, where I studied philosophy for some years, I got to know people like Leo Vidal-Thiers and Koen Margot. Leo Vidal-Thiers was also with gender problematics. Leo, however, suicided himself 6 years ago. And Koen Margot, he was working together with Jane Goodall for 2-3 years, and also invited Jane in Belgium in 2001. With those people I helped form the first animal rights movement in Belgium. At the same time, our professor of philosophy, IARC2014, did create a manifest of Gaia. This manifest of Gaia was the first source of an animal rights movement in Belgium. This manifest, Gaia is the goddess of Mother Earth, the Greek goddess of Mother Earth. So the manifest was not only about the animal rights problematic, but was also more the environmental problem. How do we act with trees? How do we act with animals? How do we act with our environment? So this was not only the cause. It take in consideration the intrinsic right, that an intrinsic right should be given to live to all human and non-human creatures as a highly necessary step in order to save our planet Earth and all its creatures from extinction. 2 years later, Gaia became a global action in the interest of animals. So under the impulse of Michel van den Bos, as first bigger animal rights movement in Belgium, Professor IARC2014 left Gaia at this moment, even when one of the purposes of this manifest did find actualization with the action group to save our animals. Nevertheless, the second part of his manifest remained dead letter. That second part concerned saving the lives of other life forms than animals. It was this point which made me 6 years ago already plead to form a movement which includes the fight for the intrinsic rights of our trees. We should break the artificial dichotomy between animals and plants. So like Peter Singer and Tom Regan and so on, they use in the animal rights philosophy a lot the sentient beings versus the non-sentient beings. So I plead for that we need to break this artificial dichotomy between animals and plants. So lately there is a lot of scientific development that also sees that there is also senses. Plants also have senses. So not only animals have sense, but also plants have senses. This dichotomy is often used by those who criticize the animal rights activists to be pathocentric. So, does anybody know what I mean with pathocentric? So that I mean with pathocentric that they see only the pathos, the feelings. So an animal has some feelings, so he can have pain, he can have some if you touch him too hard, he will scream and so on and so on. And so a lot of people who criticize us, they will say, like, oh, you only take care of the animals and you don't care about the plants and the trees and so on and so on. So if we use, as animal rights activists, the suffering argument as only point of moral consideration in order to protect our animals, we have no argument to counter our criticizers who say animal rights fighters use the speciesist argument in order to value only the animals, while being blind for what is happening with our tree and plant species. People who criticize the animal rights activists often claim that it is speciesist to value animals, but not plants. This critique has clearly validity and should be considered carefully. To avoid this critique, I propose to include tree and plant species in our moral considerations, as those living beings also have an intrinsic value. So, yes. So what is the problem? Our ethical feelings, consciousness, and responsibility towards our trees should be the same as our ethical feelings, consciousness, and responsibility towards our animals. Our respect for our trees and animals should have the same ethical ground. There is no dichotomy. It is not because a tree or plant individual manifests him or herself in another life form than we manifest ourselves, that this tree or plant individual should have less intrinsic value than an animal individual or ourselves. And ourselves, we are also an animal individual. I became vegetarian myself since my 19th year. I live on this planet Earth because our meat industry is not only responsible for the worldwide abuse and for taking the life of millions of innocent consumption animals daily, but at the same time for the demolition of the natural habitat of numerous animal individuals, and because of this, the extinction of various animal species. Apart from that, this industry is at the same time responsible for 70% of our deforestation worldwide. 70% is, well, maybe it's more. Because of this, every year, the three individuals living on a piece of land as great as England, for example, are demolished. Not to speak about the effects on our climate, the particulate matter, and other polluting materials humans spread into the environment. Not to speak about the alarming increase of floods caused by grubbing trees and deforestations. So more than enough ecological reasons to protect our oxygen suppliers as natural habitat for man and animal. I refer to a sentence of Professor Antonin Roba, who was here 2 years and 3 years ago on the Animal Rights Conference. So what said Professor Antonin Roba? from Ethiopia, from my friend Africa. Livestock now utilizes 80% of the Earth's entire land surface. Most of this 30% is permanent pasture, but it also includes the 33% of total global arable land used to produce feed for livestock. The need for more pasture land is a major driver of deforestation, especially in Latin America, where, for example, some 70% of former forests in the Amazon have been turned over to grazing. Said Anthony about 2 years ago in the conference, or 3 years ago. Most people too often tend to reduce the value of trees, in the best case, to their instrumental value. That it is not only seen as weed, if not only seen as weed or rubbish or nuisance. Falling leaves, yes, or rubbish and so on, so on. The trees, however, not only possess an instrumental value, but also at least 6 other values. Trees have in the first place their aesthetic value, as the cathedrals of Mother Earth. Oh. They have an ecological value, giving us our air, oxygen to breathe, cleaning our air. C, they have an emotional, therapeutic value. D, they have a nutritional and energetic value of their nuts and fruits, not only for us humans, but in the first place for the other animals. Then E, they have a habitat value for most of our animals, like, well, this is a bit linked with the other value, and maybe you can think of maybe other values, and there's a lot more. But above all those values, and all the ones I forgot to mention, every tree possesses, same as all our animals, a highly characteristic and individual intrinsic value, which every individual tree derives from itself. Apart from all other values they might have for us humans, the animals, the plants, and the other trees. It is indeed not because a tree individual manifests itself in another form which differs from the form we manifest ourselves that this tree individual would have less intrinsic value and a weaker right to live than a human individual or an animal individual. Both trees and animals have individual forms of living. Both are living beings. Therefore, all trees, and each from them apart, only deserve our very deep-rooted and persistent respect and should be recognized in their intrinsic right to live, same like our animals deserve their intrinsic right to live. Then, 5. Then what is the cause? So that was a bit description of the problem. So what is the cause of the problem? The cause of the problem is that we tend to consider our trees and our animals as rubbish, vermin, weed, or senseless objects. Or in the best case, we tend to value them in an instrumental way, as food, meat, fruit, nuts, pet, or material to please our needs. One of the main causes of this problem lays in our perceptions. From childhood on, we tend to accept to let us be influenced by these false perceptions, based on the way René Descartes influenced our law system via the Napoleonic Code. The Cartesian paradigm only values humans as being morally relevant creatures. Je pense donc je suis. I think so I am. So every creature who can think exists for Descartes, while he reduces all non-human creatures to objects. This way of thinking is responsible for our current law system and for the devaluation of our animals and trees A paradigm shift is urgently needed what the recognition of intrinsic life rights from our three individuals is concerned. Same as this paradigm shift is needed what the recognition of intrinsic life rights is concerned for our animal individuals. Then point 6. The consequences, then now I go to the third point, so the consequences of the problem. One of the effects of the problem I experienced till in my own garden. So the people in Belgium, they know I am in animal rights, and I was several times on the television when they were removing trees in other places and also in my city where people were living for 2 years in the trees. And they know I'm busy with that, and so what happened then? I experienced it in my own garden, where the court obliged me with obligation fees of €2,000 each day. I let live the trees who live less than 2 meters from the border of my neighbors, even if they cause not one single damage or nuisance. So you saw the picture of the tree. So that is in the best case what happens in the court. Even if a tree is 100 years old, they don't take care. They say, well, you must remove the trees if it's 1 centimeter over the border, even if the house is built maybe only 15 years and the tree is there 100 years or more, then you must, you must remove the branches. So that's in the best case. But what happened in my case, so they say I must remove all the trees who are all more than 30 years old. Normally there's a law who protects the trees of 30 years old and says like trees of 30 years old, you never must remove. But the court in Belgium doesn't watch these laws. They ignore these laws, and they say yes, you must remove the trees. They use a law of 1886 based on this Napoleonic code. That is the point that is happening. Being confronted with our mass deforestations worldwide. Yes. Yes, even the same happened in my own country 6 years ago. Officials illegally and emotionlessly killed our last 300 old and healthy trees who were living 500 meters from where I live. Despite the Flemish government had a permission given to grab 3 trees, they killed all of them. So this went for the court, and then they found, oh, on another place we plant some new trees, and yeah. So this is what is happening. Now, what are the solutions of the problem? First of all, as mentioned, a solution will not come, nor for our animals, nor for our trees, without a deep, profoundly paradigm shift, in which every single creature, animal or tree, should be reevaluated with respect in his or her intrinsic value. To grant this respect, this is only possible when our legislation here in our country and worldwide would be drastically reconsidered according to the current alarming situation of our planet Earth. It is unbelievable that our current law system still can use laws which are completely in contradiction with the dramatic situation of our Earth. Referring to the film of Al Gore, all our politicians know the implications. Even till in our gardens, in reality, in every country, almost all trees in every garden are living less than 2 meters from the border of the neighbors, of course. Almost none of these trees causes any damage, like also in my own garden is clearly the case. While nuisance is a very broad and flexible term. One partial shade or a falling leaf in autumn can be considered as nuisance. The existing, then a second point, I started, yeah. This is only possible also when the existing legislation, which implies a protection of our trees, like the law in our country, which should protect all trees who are more than 30 years old, and all other similar laws which protect the trees in every other country on this planet Earth, should be very strictly respected and researched, apart from subjective interpretations. This should lead to an effective protection of all tree individuals on this planet Earth. We can't create this paradigm shift if we keep the dichotomy tree versus animal existing. Only a paradigm shift without creating a dichotomy between trees and animals can help support a real mentality change in order to respect every individual being and its intrinsic value it lends to itself. It is clear that fighting for animal rights includes fighting for the rights of our trees as well, in order to stop any form of speciesism as moral ground. It is very sure that a vegan diet is one necessary step to reach this paradigm shift, as by eating vegan, we save the lives of up to 80% more trees and plants and 100% more animals, like Professor Roba explained us earlier. So a paradigm shift can only be workable if we include all living creatures in our axiology and not make an artificial separation, animal versus plant. As long as we consider one species inferior to another, how can we fight speciesism in its artificial roots? As biological creature, we need to eat something to survive and to live in the best possible condition, but not without taking into consideration which is the best possible way to survive for as much as possible creatures in the best possible circumstances. This leads us to a vegan fruitarian diet as the less harmful solution. To respect the intrinsic right to live of every creature, we have to save the lives of as much as possible creatures, no matter which species they belong to. Every creature should be respected in his/her individual value she lent to her or himself. Our lawmakers should be sensitized in this way worldwide, which is in the interest of every being on this beautiful planet Earth we share. This, however, did motivate me in April last year to start the global tree rights movement in order to help break these old Cartesian laws. Worldwide, which not only degrade our animals, but even our trees to senseless objects. In the present, we can't tolerate any longer the by René Descartes created objectivation of non-human creatures. If we want to save the life rights of every individual creature on this planet Earth, the Napoleonic Code and all laws derived from it, like the law book of Filth in my own country, Belgium, still degrades any non-human creature to a senseless object, till in our own gardens where we cannot even grow a tree, and our law system still follows laws like this. 2014. So I will end with with a poem I did write myself. Yes, maybe, yeah. So Francisco Mendes in Brazil said, "The forests and the trees are my brothers and sisters." Then a quote from Albert Einstein. "A human being is part of a whole, called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circles of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. That's from Albert Einstein. Then I have another quote from Thich Nhat Hanh. I know that in our previous life we were trees, and even in this life we continue to be trees. Without trees we can't have people. Therefore, trees and people inter-are. We are trees and air, bushes and clouds. If trees can't survive, humankind is not going to survive either. We get sick because we have damaged our own environment, and we are in mental anguish because we are so far away from our true mother, Mother Nature. Then I will end with a poem I did write myself. If I were a tree. On a question asked me by a friend, which answered me which animal I would like to be, I remember I responded this. I don't know, my friend, which animal I really would like to be protected from the humans. And if I were an animal living in a female body, I would maybe be a spider. It would, however, be more beautiful to be a tree on an unreachable island for humans because of the current from the sea, with birds, squirrels, lizards, and all kinds of insects living in me. I would love to give them a home and food for my fruits, for their kids, and oxygen to breathe, giving the bees honey, and let my flowers being inseminated by them, and the wind offering me their music playing in my leaves. If I were a tree, I would love to give without asking nothing in return. If I were a tree, I would love to be rooted in the earth, feeling as one with the earth and the sun, who lets me produce by photosynthesis oxygen to breathe for all animals living in me and breathing my oxygen. I would love to be independent, living in peace with animals, breathing my air and eating my fruits or my nuts, at the same time enjoying the smell of my flowers. I shouldn't need to eat in order to survive. I repeat. I shouldn't need to eat in order to survive. One or more of my animal brothers and sisters, nor my plant and tree brothers and sisters. I would be happy to live only from the water, feeding my roots, and the sun feeding my crown, my leaves, my fruits, and my flowers. Thank you for being a tree. Yeah. Thank you. I don't know if there's some question or...
Hi. Thank you for pointing out that we should take more care of the earth in general.
I don't know if
pollution. Hello, can you hear me? However, to the theory of tree rights, you make the point that the distinction between animals and plants is sort of artificial, and that in fact scientists pointed out that plants have feelings too. That's something that you sort of said. The source of this claim...
Senses, yes.
Senses, yes. The source of this claim typically comes from Bose. I don't know where you got your information from, who you were quoting, but the source typically, I investigated this, and typically comes from a scientist, an Indian scientist called Bose. And if you actually read his original...
I don't know him. Yeah.
Okay, if you actually read his original publication, what he did, basically he took muscles of animals or humans and he cut the muscle and he measured a current flow. Then he took a cucumber and did the same thing and measured a current flow. And then he even measured current flows in metals that he heard, which of course we now know is induction. So the basis for the argument that plants have the same range that we might attribute to animals is kind of problematic, because if you extend it in that regard, you end up even giving metals and other inanimate objects the same rights we would then have to attribute to plants. The problem with this paper is that basically what he did is prove that there is a current in material and inanimate and animate material. So I kind of don't see how we can extract from that, or other research that is very similar, how we can extract from that the claim that that you basically put forth, that plants deserve intrinsic value, which I simply don't see, because I can observe that animals have the same capacity for pain and suffering that I have, so I can attribute them that they should be liberated. But I don't see how that applies to plants in that regard. So maybe you could comment on that.
Thank you for I didn't know the Indian scientist, so thank you for
read the paper.
Yeah, thank you. But I followed last year there was someone following my speech last year, Gabriele Sakat, and she informed me about a course given by Professor Shamovitz in the University of Tel Aviv. And the course was from Sakat, I think, yes. And this course was about plant senses, and they give again the course, I think next month they start again the course. So I can, well, if I have to talk about the course, I need maybe 4 hours. But there's a lot of, well, what I can say, there's a lot of research, and already in the time of Darwin, so Darwin, the late Darwin, made a lot of research into plant senses. And there is an evidence, the plants have different senses. For example, what visual perception is concerned, we have 5 photoreceptors for light. Plants have 12 photoreceptors for light. That's only the visual. So if we touch, for example, there's also some experiences with mimosas, the plant. Yes. And if you touch the mimosis plant, there is also the plant. The leaves are immediately closing because of the touching. Another example of memory, that's an example of memory in plants, is like the Venus flytrap. So the Venus flytrap, it was they say the meat-eating plants, they say so if the leaves are open, and if the fly is coming into the leaves and it touches one particular in the leaf, then in between 20 seconds, it touches the other hair in the leaf, then it closes. If it's more than 20 seconds, it doesn't close. So that's one example of short-term memory. There's examples of long-term memory. For example, if you cut a tree and you cut one side, like you see with the oak tree, or with well, maybe the oak tree will not survive, but if you do on one side of the plant, you cut then in the next generation on this side, if you have 2 leaves on the left side, they will not regrow. They will only grow new particulars of the plant on the one side of the plant. So that's one sign of long-term memory. Well, there's always more and more research in plants, how plants have senses and so on. So, well, for me, there is no reason to say you cannot eat anymore a plant. We must survive, so we must eat something. And as I explained, if we have to eat something, the most I see no argue to eat not vegan, and maybe the best as fruitarian maybe is a step further to cause as less harm as possible. But for me, yeah, we must search for a way to, if we, whatever nutrition is concerned, to eat. Yes, what causes the less harm as possible, and take into consideration that plants have also senses, but in another way than plants don't have neocortex. Everyone knows plants have no neocortex, but they have senses in another way, like I explained. But the course is about. It's very interesting to follow from Professor Shermovitz is over Coursera in Tel Aviv University, but you can see on the internet, and I followed it last year, and Steen also partly followed. So, yeah. Yeah.
If you're interested about this, it's a new field of research called plant neurobiology. So the scientists, they disagree about the name that they given this subject, but nevertheless, they discovered that plants in the past decades, so they discovered that plants have ways of sensing their environment, hearing, seeing, touching, smelling, communicating, information processing, more complex than we thought. So if you're interested in the field, it's called plant neurobiology. Other questions? Yeah. Okay, over there, question?
I didn't really get what is the criteria on which you base your analysis, because sometimes you talk as if the criteria was just the life, so you talk about trees, so I suppose you also talk about all other plants. So this this makes me think to the biocentric movement, but sometimes you talk also you talk about the living things as a whole. So it's more like an ecocentrist view. And sometimes also, like you just did, you talk about the sensitiveness of the plants. So I don't get really which is the criteria you choose to give value, an intrinsic value to the plants and the animals and everything. So is it the life? Is it the role in the ecosystem? Is it a pathocentric view? I don't really get it. Can you please answer?
Well, thank you for the remark. Well, I think the most important thing is we must start from a point of respect. So and try to respect for the being itself. So not seeing it as an instrument. That's also a value. So I said there are about 6, or maybe there are 10, there are 20 kinds of valuation systems. But the intrinsic value, I think this is the most important value we must take into consideration to give respect, because now we think in a way of like the Cartesian way of thinking, and in a way of objects. So plants are only objects, animals are only objects. So it's the same way if we give an intrinsic value to an animal, what is our criterion to give no intrinsic value to a tree, for example? Yeah.
So my question was more like, which is the criteria on which you can say that the plants do have the right to a moral consideration, but not a metal or a rock. So is it because it's a living thing? Is it because of it can sense suffering? How come you can say this category of thing or a living thing does deserve moral consideration and an intrinsic value, and not this one? Is it every living thing or every suffering?
I should also maybe go further, and maybe we must also, if we make a material from we must also respect it. We will not say we make a computer, for example, and we say, oh, we can throw it in. So I think that's a basic thing. We must respect everything. Not only, well, of course, a tree and an animal, but of course we must also have respect for everything. Especially if we use as instrument already a part of a tree to make something, and then we cannot say now we don't have respect we don't respect it anymore. Or yeah.
So I try to speak loud enough. So why don't you talk about plant rights then instead of tree rights, for example? And what about the kingdoms of fungi, for example? Bacteria? Should I repeat there?
Yeah, I understand, yeah.
So my question was right from the beginning, why you then would not talk about plant rights instead of tree rights? Why do you always point out the trees? I mean, of course, this is to be taken serious, but why isn't it plant rights instead? And what about the other kingdoms of, for example, of fungi or of bacteria? It's the same question. What is the criteria? Is it life, or what is it? Recently you said we have to respect everything, everyone and everything on this planet, but I agree, I don't quite get the criteria. Where is the border? Why is it trees and not all the other plants? All the other plants could consider this speciesistic, for example.
Yes, of course.
That's my question.
Yes, that's a good question. Yes, of course, we must have respect for every being, every plant also, not only the trees. Well, I say because I speak about tree rights, so I use trees. But of course, we must have also respect for a flower or a little plant. But of course, we must also survive, and sometimes we must offer some plant to eat it. So that's a bit the paradox in that we always have to, the same with bacteria and so on, if we die from it, then we can say yes, then or we must die, or the bacteria must survive, or the virus must survive. And yes, it's always point of moral always a point of moral consideration, and yeah, this is not so easy. Yeah. I don't say it's black white. No, it's yeah. Thank you.
Yes, I just wanted to thank you for sharing our philosophy with us, and I wanted to ask you, how would you consider your philosophy to relate to two systems with which it seems to overlap, already existing, that incorporate a lot of those principles? One of them being biocentrism, the belief that all life is equal, and looking at life less as individual species, more as communities of life, and superorganisms, which has largely been proven recently through all the madness of genetic sequencing, which has discovered that there's actually the difference between species doesn't exist as much as we thought, that totally unrelated species can actually trade DNA through molecular walls and actually become more symbiotic, like really huge chunks of E. coli bacteria have been found in our own DNA, for example. And the second one that I wanted to ask your opinion on is the movement for rights of nature, which has been incorporated into the constitutions of Ecuador and Bolivia, which expands the notions of human rights, the UN Charter of Human Rights, into rights of nature, animal rights, and also protection of ecosystems.
And what is
Cool.
what is your question in?
I just wanted to ask you, how would you say your philosophy overlaps with the ideas of biocentrism and the movement for rights of nature? Because I see a lot of overlap as well. How would you relate to those two philosophies, for example?
Yeah, I think everything is related to each other. So it's difficult to say. Biocentrism is also a word. Ecocentrism is a word we use, but I think the basic must always be respect for the individual. I don't think in terms of systems. I rather think in terms of individual rights. So the same as there is a human, so every human has to be respected as an individual. Same tree also has to be respected apart from other valuations, also as an individual. So I think this is, I don't know if this is an answer to your question or maybe yes, I didn't get it.
Speaking of trees, one of the largest superorganisms found were actually trees. Like, for example, birch trees very often are just one organism that can spread over hundreds and hundreds of acres and actually be interconnected to the root structure. And all the individual trees that you, for example, see are actually parts of the same large superorganism.
Yeah, of course.
So perhaps sometimes the difference between individuals isn't so hard to see, and also the perception of Gaia, looking at Earth as a superorganism. I think sometimes perhaps we have a tendency to fracture life into little segments that we can classify, and forgetting of the whole, and also of the functionality of ecosystems too, how, like, by taking one chunk, the functionality is actually impaired as well.
Yeah, of course, everything. Yeah, it's. What will I answer to this? I don't know. I don't know directly how to answer this question, but it's a good thing to think about, of course. Kun je of zien hierdoor iets? No. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, maybe. Yeah. But we can talk. We can talk personally about. Yeah. Thank you.